On this episode of Skeptiko, guest host Dr. Rich Grego brings us interviews from the 2012 Psychology Association Conference in Orlando.
Okay, where should we go next? Probably because you said we want to keep Krippner to the end, we should probably play Robert Almeter, right?
Almeder, yeah.
Okay, here goes that clip.
Aristotle claimed his philosophical that humans were distinct from animals and that humans were rational, but the animals were non-rational because they didn't show an understanding of means-to-end relationship.
Right.
And evidenced in the fact that they didn't use tools. And Jane Goodall conclusively, I think, refuted that by on the camera, where everybody saw the animals using their tools that they created.
I also love the Jane Goodall reference. I think it really brought home this idea that science can't really be pinned down the way that scientism often does. And his point is just obvious that Jane Goodall's videos changed science, changed the scientific consensus, not in a way that we normally think of as testable or anything like that, but just by making it self-evident.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, again, I suppose, happened over and over again in science, so that trying to define, trying to make the claim somehow that the status of current science is this all-encompassing total description of the way reality must be, is, if you look at the history of science, sort of an obviously unfounded claim.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and on this episode, we have a series of very interesting interviews from the American Psychology Association Conference, brought to us by Dr. Rich Grego. There's some really great material here that Rich has brought us, and there's a lot of material. I asked Rich to condense it down, but I've also asked him to come on after each clip to join me in a little bit of a discussion. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Let's get right to my dialogue with Dr. Rich Grego. Today we welcome Dr. Richard Grego back to Skeptiko. Rich is a philosophy professor at Florida State College and has jumped in here as a guest host in the past here on Skeptiko. He's here today to bring us some very interesting interviews he did while covering the American Psychological Association Conference in Orlando, Florida here in 2012. So, Rich, welcome back to Skeptiko. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks. It's great to be back.
Well, we've had this conversation via email and a couple of phone calls as you propose this idea that, hey, I'm here and I'm interested in attending these conferences. How about covering them for Skeptiko? And I thought that was just a great idea. So I first have to thank you very much for bringing us these interviews. And we also have to tell folks that you also covered for us the Parapsychology Association Conference in Durham, North Carolina. And those interviews are going to be coming up in a future episode. So again, thanks for doing this.
Sure. I thought it was just the kind of thing that the Skeptiko constituency would find interesting and appreciate. So.
Absolutely. I love the way we're going to be able to show folks some different views from both within the psychology community, but also within the parapsychology community. So it gives us a good lay of the land in terms of where some of these ideas are going among intellectuals and professionals in this way.
Yeah, I agree. And I was happy to see that they at least did have some presentations there, this one in particular, that addressed the sort of concerns regarding consciousness studies, that at least the same sort of concerns that the parapsychological community is interested in as well. I mean, I thought that's a promising development in the psychological community.
Right. So, Rich, tell us first about the APA conference in general. For folks who don't know about it, what is it? How big is it? Who is there? How many, different panels and presentations are there? That kind of thing.
Oh, okay. Well, it's as you can imagine, it's the scholarly presentation of that community, of the psychological community's sort of intellectual elite and you know and trends within and scholarly trends within the field. It's a huge conference that's national and really international in scope, and it takes place every year over the course of several days. This is the first one I attended. That's not my sort of academic discipline in particular, but I was interested in this presentation and a few others, and there are thousands of people there. They hold it this one they held at the Orlando Conference Center, which is, you can imagine, is a huge conference center. So it's a huge professional meeting that encompasses that encompasses the interests and the research that the entire community is involved in. So
great. And this particular panel that you focused on, tell us about that.
Yeah, well, the idea kind of for this project that you and I had discussed arose when a very alert former student of mine informed me that a panel of impressive scholars on the topic of, and this is the title of the panel, exploring frontiers of the mind-brain relationship, which is also incidentally the title of an excellent book that has just come out, and that was the focal point for this panel. They're all, the people who presented on it are all contributors to this book that has recently come out, and this topic, obviously, exploring the frontiers of the mind-brain relationship, is one that is one that's of concern to people at Skeptiko, and these scholars are conducting the kind of research that points to the possibility of particularly non-materialistic conceptions of consciousness. I thought that it would be exactly the kind of thing, and speaking with the people there would be exactly the kind of topic that Skeptiko would be interested in exploring. So,
great. So, Rich, why don't you tee up the first interview? Which clip are we going to play first? And by the way, I should mention to people, Rich has brought us 3 interviews, each one about 11 minutes long. So he's going to introduce each, and then we'll have a very brief little discussion about it afterwards, and then we'll get to the next one. So which one should we do first, Rich?
I guess we might want to end with Stanley Krippner if he's the most controversial. Maybe if we start with the dual interview I conducted with Dr. Alexander Moreira-Almeida and Dr. Erlendur Haraldsson. That might be the most appropriate.
Okay, and tell us real quickly about these two folks.
Oh, sure. Dr. Alexander Moreira-Almeida, PhD, MD, is a psychiatrist and a psychologist, I guess is his other field, with the Federal University of Brazil, Juiz de Fora, I believe. If my Portuguese is rusty, forgive me. And he's done a lot of consciousness research in many venues over the years. He's widely published. And then, of course, Dr. Erlendur Haraldsson is a past guest, I believe, on Skeptiko, and I think you interviewed him. And he is a psychology professor at the University of Iceland. And they presented it on this panel, respectively, on the topics of sort of a history of mediumship in Western science. And that was Dr. Moreira-Almeida, and then Dr. Haroldson presented his recent research on cases of reincarnation, and both of them focused their discussions on the issue of what the implications of this research is for conceptions of what consciousness is, particularly in relation to the body and the physical.
Great. It sums it up very nicely. I'm going to play that interview. First, I have to just mention, I'm pretty sure it was Andy Paquette who interviewed Haroldson.
Oh, okay.
But still very interesting. Let's play that interview, and then we'll be back to talk about it.
The end of materialism is a term that has gone beyond philosophical speculation to gain some evidential currency of late. What does the general trend of your research, your respective research findings, reveal about the relationship between the mind and the brain, or if you want to be more abstract, the mental and the physical? I guess for not only for the field of psychology, but maybe for the fields of philosophy and the other social and behavioral sciences, and maybe for the cultural paradigm in general.
I think that's exactly what we argue in the book as a whole. I think the whole evidence points that matter or brain cannot explain everything. Of course, it's important. Of course, we need to take in consideration all the studies about brain and things like that. But I think the evidence points that there is something beyond the brain, that the mind is related to the brain, but it's not necessarily produced by the brain, that it can, in some sense, act and survive to brain, exist beyond the brain. I think it has become very clear when we study the whole range of phenomena. Of course, some people can accept that, some people are in doubt, some people will never accept that, but I think that this is at least a reasonable working hypothesis. Yeah. I think it should be allowed as a truly scientific spirit, because I think a truly scientific spirit should be open-minded and rigorous at the same time. This is what makes good science. Yeah. So in good science, we should allow different paradigm candidates compete. We should allow this. Yeah. I think it's okay that we have reductionist paradigm working and try to show what they are able to explain and to produce. Right. And at the same time, I think it should be allowed non-reductionist views of mind also work, present their data, and engage in this good scientific discussion.
And I assume you'd say the implications for the receptivity to this non-reductionist view of mind could possibly be tremendous. I'm thinking of your practice in general, what you do in clinical practice. And you supervise, correct? You were just telling me psychiatry students, correct? Yeah. I would think just in that application alone, the receptivity to the notion that consciousness is more than just the brain it would be huge, correct?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the reasons that makes people so passionately involved in against and for these ideas is because we are discussing the human nature. Yeah. That's the point. It's a very deep question. It's a big question. We are discussing the human nature. We are discussing who we are. Yeah. Exactly. I think when we believe, when we have evidence that we are just the product of our brain activity, or that we are something beyond that, it has huge implications for our understanding of ourselves, for our lives, and also for therapeutic treatments also.
Yeah. Any philosophical reflections for your own?
I almost forgotten your question.
Just the implications of the notion that of the end of materialism with regard to consciousness for the field of psychology, for instance.
I do not see any end to materialism forthcoming very soon. Because that is sort of materialism has some very strong points for us.
Sure.
But there are some findings and some facts that have come through, particularly late in the 19th century and also in this century or last century, say, that are not are not easy to explain in a materialistic way.
Sure.
And then, of course, there are the mediumistic phenomena that we already had in the late 19th century. And then we have the phenomena of various psychic phenomena like the appearance of the dead and so on.
Right.
Then we started to study near-death experiences in the latter part of last century, and then about that time we also started to study the cases of the reincarnation type.
Sure.
So now there is some empirical facts which are hard to explain in the materialistic way. And so nowadays, earlier we only had really religion that pointed to something beyond the material. And but now we have some facts through research that point to that materialism has its limits and may not be real for everything.
Right.
And has its weaknesses.
And I think if we take a philosophical and a historical perspective, and even if mainly if we analyze the most recent studies about science and religion, the history of science and religion, there are very good books recently published on this by Harvard University, Oxford University, and Cambridge University, and so on. And most of these books have shown that actually the analysis of the material world, in addition to a non-material perspective of the world, was the norm throughout human history and throughout history of human thinking, philosophy and science and so on. Different from what we usually believe, even in the scientific revolution, the 16th century, 18th century, most of scientists took for granted the existence of a non-material realm in the universe. Most scientists like Copernicus, like Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Francis Bacon, all of the founders of modern science took for granted the non-material aspect of the universe. So if we analyze in a very broad perspective, take the big picture, this more reductionist materialistic view is ideology that became strong actually basically in the middle of 19th century, and it has become it has faced some problems nowadays. So when we take the big picture, actually these more reductionist views of the universe predominate basically for 1 century or a bit more than this. So it's not natural to science to take a materialistic reductionist view of science. Actually, most of the scientists in the history had not taken this perspective. I think to analyze this, it's important. As I told you, as we have discussed previously, it's a metaphysical assumption. It's okay to have this assumption, but it's wrong to assume that to be a good scientist, you need to assume this metaphysical assumption. Because most of the good scientists, the founders of the science as a whole, they had not accepted this. So I think we need to take in consideration all the things that we know about the material world, of course, and the social aspects and so on, biological and so on, but the idea of taking in consideration non-material aspects of the universe, we are just trying to add another thing to help to explain the whole range of things that happen in the universe.
Sure. And I guess as a closing question for each of you, just to answer, not just as scientists or professionals, but as whole people, gut feeling. For some, if a kid asks you, what's going to happen to me when I die, or if somebody as simple-minded as me just asks you, what is your gut feeling about what is consciousness? What are we essentially? What would your answer be? You guys take that.
What is...
After all, the upshot of all the research you've done and the experiences you've had, what do you think it is? What do you think we are?
Consciousness we really can't define. That's just what we are or what we think we are. And our awareness, that's consciousness. And but still, it is a very sort of fluctuating thing. Every night we sleep for 8 hours. We don't know where we are. We have no awareness. Right. At least when we wake up, we have none. But maybe there is just our memory doesn't remember.
Okay. No, that's fair enough. I don't know. There's definitely no right answer to that question.
I think that, first of all, there are several different definitions of what is consciousness. Sure. If you define it as the first-person perspective, I think basically that, of course, we need to learn a lot of yet we need to learn a lot. We need to much more research and reflection on this. But at least I think that the empirical evidence available points that this first person perspective is not just the product of the brain, that it can exist beyond the brain. I think we have reasonable evidence to think on this, but of course we need to work more on this, to test this hypothesis and to advance our understanding and in a very open-minded and rigorous way. I think that's the point. And I think this is the importance of discussing this in a high-level academic environment, because if you do not allow this to be discussed in high-level academic environment, it will be discussed in a low intellectual environment that will not make any advance and good advance. So I think we need exactly to discuss this, to have people that would like to engage in a good discussion and to point the limitations, to discuss how to move the things forward.
So, Rich, I'm really glad we played that clip first, because I think here are two researchers, scientists who just come out pretty directly and say, hey, we need to get with the program and acknowledge that this idea of materialism doesn't really fit the data. That was my takeaway from it. How about you?
For me, there were three big sort of issues that they examined, really quickly. And the first would have been that, if you look at the history of reincarnation and mediumship in the West from a historical as well as a scientific perspective, that attempts to account for either mediumship or consciousness in terms of reductive materialist science really hasn't succeeded in the last 300 years, or even made any substantial progress, other than, of course, developing more sophisticated sort of technical descriptions of neural processes and things like that. But in terms of really explaining consciousness, it hasn't been successful. And then, secondly, I'd say that the reductive materialist explanations for this kind of phenomenon in particular, and for consciousness experience generally, are a historical aberration, even in science, as I think Dr. Morera pointed out in this clip pretty ably, that most scientists throughout the history of the West haven't themselves confined their conception of consciousness to a materialist paradigm. And then, sort of finally, an explanation for this kind of stuff, in terms of psi or discarnate spirits, is really a plausible scientific hypothesis that should be taken seriously. So that's what I took away from it anyway.
Great. Okay, where should we go next? What should we play next? Probably, because you said we want to keep Krippner to the end, we should probably play so. Robert Almeter, right?
Almeder, yeah.
Okay, here goes that clip.
The materialist explanation for consciousness is that it is either completely identical to brain states.
Yeah, right? That's the
or
most.
That or that it's in some weird sense. And I wanted to talk about with you a little bit about the sort of discrepancies in this. But the other one is the other explanation would be that it's sort of the non-reductive materialists say that, well, you can't just say that they're only the mental states are only brain states. There's something else, but they still supervene on physical brain states. That there's something else, but they're contingent on brain states, right? And substance dualists, of course, or Cartesian dualists say that the mental is a property that is just non-physical, correct? And that is what you're asserting.
Yes, that there are things in the world that are not physical objects, that are causal agents interacting with bodies, and they seem to be the repository of these, what you mean, of certain memories that constitute the identity of these people. I don't know what else to say, but that seems to be the...
And you advance these 5 materialist objections to dualism.
I didn't get a chance in the talk to explain it, so maybe I could do some of it here.
Sure. And the first is then?
The first is that the first one you get typically from science is that belief in the existence of Cartesian immaterial substances is simply not testable or confirmable.
Right.
And what they then say is therefore belief in the ghost in the machine is not a scientific question. It has to fall into philosophy or religion or superstition. Yeah. Now, that's interesting because you could say, I will say in a minute, it is quite testable and that sort of thing. But even if it weren't testable, suppose they seem to feel that once you put something in the category of philosophy or superstition or religion, that's the kiss of death.
Yeah.
Because after all, we all know that
scientific.
philosophers, we all know it's not scientific, but it's also that we all know that philosophers have never agreed substantially, so the argument goes, substantially on anything. And
you argue that science is in the same condition.
Well, I argue that philosophers do agree more than people think. Nobody believes anymore that I could be the only person in the world.
Right.
And that was refuted conclusively, but it wasn't by appeal to experiments of any sort. It was a case. There's this woman named Christine Ladd Franklin who wrote to Bertrand Russell after Russell had actually defended this claim that he was the only person in the world. Yeah. And she wrote and said, "I agree with you, Professor Russell. I think it was a wonderful, fine argument, and I too am a solipsist."
Yeah.
Now Russell thought she made some sort of a mistake, but I think she must have been a very clever lady.
Solipsism, of course, being the
view that I'm the only person in the world, and of course it couldn't be true. If I'm the only the argument makes everybody the only person in the world.
Right.
That's a contradiction.
Sure.
So she refuted that, and it's never come back. I haven't seen anybody take it seriously.
Yeah.
So there's a philosophical position that got refuted. Aristotle claimed his philosophical that humans were distinct from animals, and that humans were rational, but the animals were non-rational, because they didn't show an understanding of means to end relationship, and that they couldn't, and evidenced in the fact that they didn't use tools.
Yeah.
Whereas they even said things like, if you can get me a horse that could add up a column of figures, or and so on.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So that theory, and Jane Goodall conclusively, I think, refuted that by on the camera, where everybody saw the animals using their tools that they created.
So on the whole, I guess then
there was another argument too, that there were a lot of them that philosophers agreed on.
Sure.
When Hume said there's no idea for which there's not a corresponding impression of sense, except one. I mean, people said, look, that's a counterexample to that important position, and nobody believes it anymore. I mean, you never get an impression of a chiliagon, a thousand-sided figure, but they are there, and you know what it means.
Right.
And but in and the scientists too, you overemphasize their successes. Yes, they've had a lot of successes, but remember, there was Ptolemaic astronomy, the view that the Earth went around the Sun went around the Earth. There was absolute space and time. There was the Hume theory of disease. There was
phrenology.
Phrenology. And what's the thing? There's another one there that I really like.
The luminous ether, maybe.
The phlogiston theory of combustion.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, these were thought of as they had good predictions, and they were wrong. They were wrong. And so science, even though they can have a consensus, can be refuted very easily if the consensus changes as a result of more and changing sorts of evidence that enter into the picture as we go along. Right. So that's the way, you can just put aside the first objection.
And the
second one is argues that it is testable. The thesis is testable and confirmable. But it just hasn't been confirmed. And that was put out by Derek Parfit in his book Reasons and Persons.
And then H.A. Eyre, too.
Derek Parfit had a section in that book. That was an Oxford book in 1994, I think. 84, 94, I'm not sure right now. He had a section there, number 82, which was what it would have taken to prove that there were Cartesian immaterial substances. And this is where he starts off by saying, some people think that the idea of a Cartesian immaterial substance is absurd. That some people claim that it's absurd, irrational. That I don't agree with that claim. And they said, because you could get some good evidence, suppose that this lady, and then he used the reincarnation example. He said, suppose this lady came up with a story about remembering that she died 2,000 years earlier, and she had a bracelet that had 2 dragons on it, and she buried it near a monolith, the ground hasn't. And she had other details like that. And then you went out and you went to the place where she said she buried it with a graphologist. You went to the place and you found that, in fact, the equipment, the things were there, and everything else she said was unearthed in this way.
That would be scientific, empirical.
It would be empirical. It's something that would be predicted by the theory.
Sure.
And if that all came up, if all her memories, these memories are actual predictions of how you're supposed to go out and confirm them for not being quasi memories, but for being real memories. So he went on and said, so it would be, if you got those kind of cases, if there were a large number of them, and if you couldn't refute the thesis by some other thesis that had the same effects, he said you would be obliged, he said, to believe in reincarnation. He said, of course, but what that would mean is that we would have to think about memory quite differently. It couldn't be identified with a particular brain state at any given time. It would have to be something that is not associated with the brain. And then he goes on and says, well, but do we have those facts? He said, no. So,
and his criteria, what would satisfy that standard for him, I guess you mentioned, was that if most people were having these things, you saw these things all the time, right?
Yeah,
if most people had these experiences.
He insisted that they have a lot of people doing it.
And you think that's unfair?
I think it's too strong a requirement. Because after all, if you've got 10 people who have this wonderful story, and you can't refute it, why don't you just say in those 10 cases people reincarnate? I don't know whether they will do it again. And I don't. But I have no plausible way to explain this. Except
well, I'm thinking that the skeptical response, of course, to this would be that, surely, if this was a real phenomenon,
see more of it.
We'd have more. At least we'd be able to gather through science, through the empirical studies, more robust evidence for it.
Well, that's what's interesting about this, because you should be able to do it. I proposed a way in Death and Personal Survival. I just said, look, just get a group of people that you regress that claim to have memories of a certain sort, and test them. See what percentage of them. Test them, and if they claim to be Napoleon Bonaparte, you say, well, tell me something that only Napoleon would know, and tell me a lot of stuff, and so you could test them very simply, or you could get people who have memories like that, and then some of them, as soon as you test them, some will go out.
Sure.
But there will be a smaller case that have these, not only the memories, but they'll have the acquired skills, the language skills of the former person that they're talking about.
Isn't that what reincarnation researchers sort of are doing, or
yes,
tried to do?
Well, they're still trying it. It's not very well funded, but I think insofar there was 4,000 cases when I wrote that book 20 years ago, and there are more in Virginia. There's another 6,000, and a lot of people do work at it, and it's accumulating fairly strongly. The idea that you can refute it.
Okay, I love Almeder, and interviewed him a long time ago, but I think he's just refreshing as a philosopher. He's so down to earth in some ways, but also very adroit and intellectual, and you kind of get both sides of that. So I think that's great. What were the points that really resonated with you from this?
I think, it was a pretty sort of strictly philosophical approach to the topic. He really wasn't discussing any specific empirical data, but I think, which is one of the things that I just sort of as a professional philosopher myself, I kind of enjoyed as well. And I would say, again, similar to the other speakers, I think, the most salient aspect for me of what he was, the sort of the point that he was making is that if you try to conceive of consciousness or mind, if you want to call it that, in non-physical terms, you're not being any less necessarily scientific than trying to conceive of mind in physical terms, because reductive materialism or physicalism is really a philosophical assumption. It's not some kind of an empirically demonstrated scientific fact. And that reductive materialism as well really isn't necessarily essential to science or to the scientific study of consciousness, even though I think a lot of the skeptics seem to think that it is. Materialistic explanations of conscious experience are really no simpler or less fraught with logical difficulties than dualistic explanations as he's defined them are. So that, for me, was an important thing.
Yeah, great. I also love the Jane Goodall reference. I think it really brought home this idea that science can't really be pinned down the way that scientism often does. And his point is just obvious, that Jane Goodall's videos changed science, changed the scientific consensus, not in a way that we normally think of as testable or anything like that, but just by making it self-evident. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's, again, I suppose, happened over and over again in science, so that trying to define, trying to make the claim somehow that the status of current science is this all-encompassing description of total description of the way reality must be, is, if you look at the history of science, sort of an obviously unfounded claim.
Right. Okay, then finally, let's get to Stanley Krippner. Tell us a little bit first, for folks who don't know who Stanley Krippner is.
Stanley Krippner, of course, I think most people are, even not even people within the field of psychology, know is one of these sort of preeminent figures that sort of spans disciplines across disciplines in many areas of psychology. And he's just published all kinds of published all kinds of groundbreaking work and done all kinds of groundbreaking research for decades now, and is really almost a celebrity figure. And what he did was actually organize this panel, I believe, and he chaired the panel. Although he did not present any papers in it, but of course, since the idea for it was at least in part his conception, I wanted to try to get his sort of overall, his general perspective on what he thought the whole session conveyed.
Great. Let's play that clip.
Most scientists, in other words, tend to be materialists and believe that the consciousness is biologically based, whereas most of the wider public does not.
Sure.
My sense from reading your work and things about you is that your tone seems to be, in a really responsible, rigorous sort of sense, cautiously optimistic regarding the possibility of non-physical consciousness. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that's fair.
You don't seem like you're not willing to, as a scientist and a critical thinker, to make up your mind completely, but you seem to think that the evidence, would you say that the evidence that you can, on the whole, tends to support that notion?
I would say so, although I remain agnostic on most of these issues.
The specific ones?
I for better or for worse, I don't think that you could call me a believer in much of anything.
Yeah. So I believe I read that, a quote, I guess from you via that fascinating article in the San Francisco Weekly about your life and career. That was fascinating. Yeah.
I don't know how they got quotations from Ray Hyman and James Randi, but they did, and I really liked what they had to say.
Yeah. They're big fans, apparently, which one would not necessarily expect. But I guess that testifies to your ability to command the respect, as that article pointed out, of both, again, a highly, I guess, if you'll excuse the term, skeptical materialists, as well as well-established parapsychological researchers who believe in.
They make a point. They make a very good point, and I think that that's part of the dialogue that is so badly needed today.
Yeah, which you certainly encouraged. One of the things, speaking of which, reading about so many of your sort of personal experiences, not necessarily in the laboratory or via experiments, some of which, though, are really fascinating, like the Maimonides Hospital Dream Lab, I guess it was called,
Yes.
experiments, seem like very powerful evidence for the possibility of a non-material consciousness. But just some of these other things I was reading about where you were in you're in other cultures, and I don't know whether it was Brazil, where this a medium of some sort was produced teleporting stones and physical objects. Those would seem to me to be incredible experiences to have, and it seems to me, if I had them, if I was you, to make me, I guess, I don't know if believer is the right term, because I guess you're not sure what it is you believe in, but certainly they would convince me that there must be more to the makeup of the substance of reality as we understand it than the physical sciences can provide us with. Is that
at the present time?
Yeah.
Yes, that's a very good way to put it. That these personal experiences indicate to me that there are still unfilled gaps in terms of our understanding of the universe, and maybe even in terms of the basic assumptions we have about the nature of the universe.
And you tend then to think that there is, at least as science currently defines the term physical or material, which itself is, I guess, problematic. But
very problematic, yes.
In terms of the way science currently defines the term, you would say that then that's wrong. Or at least it's too reductive for you to be comfortable
I would not use the word right or wrong, good heavens.
Yeah.
I would simply say it's incomplete or too reductive.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, you're using terms that I don't use myself.
Right. Sure. Yeah, I don't want to cheat. So what do you attribute the big discrepancy between pretty valid, valid researchers, like, say, a Dean Radin on one end of the spectrum, who says there's clear evidence for a non-physical dimension of consciousness and the universe and the way it operates and its dynamics. And on the other end of the spectrum, say, Richard Wiseman is a prominent researcher whose name comes to mind and is readily recognized, who says there's absolutely none. And they're both looking at the same data. They've both conducted experiments.
They're both very bright. They're both smarter than I am.
Yeah. Well, what do we attribute that?
Well, I say, isn't this interesting? This is an interesting dialogue. It's a intellectual dance, and I follow it with great interest. And let's see where it leads.
Fair enough. And then on the spectrum yourself, if you had to place yourself on the spectrum between mind as entirely physical on one end, and perhaps on the other end, idealism, or mind as the fundamental substrate, perhaps, of everything, where would you put yourself on that? Would you
I actually wrote an article about that in the International Journal of Transpersonal Studies. And I don't really see this as amenable to a spectrum at all. I see it more as a system. I think that what we call mind, what we call matter, are constantly interacting. And sometimes the interaction seems to go one way, sometimes the interaction seems to go another way. Just like sometimes there's a wave and sometimes there's a particle.
Right. Yeah.
Sometimes there is E in the EM squared, sometimes there's M in the EM squared that becomes more obvious.
Since you mention it, do you think there are there's promising work being done in quantum physics that might yield some positive results for explaining at least parapsychological phenomena that doesn't have to be then framed in a strictly material or non-material way?
Well, yes, I think there's some promising work. Not being a physicist, I would hesitate to in any way make myself knowledgeable enough to render a verdict. I think that too many people who are not physicists jump on the quantum physics bandwagon and say, well, this is going to be the key that unravels the mysteries. maybe it will, but I'd have to know a lot more about quantum physics to make that leap of faith. Well, for all we know, it'll come from anthropology. We might find some remote tribe that has what we call psychic abilities pretty much under control, have repeated them, can demonstrate them to outsiders, and that might be even more convincing than anything that quantum physics comes up with.
Yeah.
So you never know where the breakthroughs in science are going to come from.
Sure. And do you think science should listen more to, or be more receptive, perhaps, to understandings of consciousness that come to us from other traditions, say spiritual traditions, wisdom traditions, whatever you want to call them, religious traditions and things like that?
Well, I think there's something to be learned from all of these traditions.
You certainly have. I guess that's why I asked.
Yes, I think that, again, consciousness is a term I really don't like to use because it's overused. It means different things to different people.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, there are Eastern concepts that don't have a mind-brain problem or a mind-body problem. There are even Latin American concepts that are ultra-sophisticated. There are Navajo and other Native American concepts, Iroquois concepts, Blackfoot concepts that you can look at in a certain way and say, well, this is what quantum physics is talking about. So indigenous people have been wrestling with trying to explain the universe. Some of them have come up with ideas that are really pretty sophisticated.
Sure.
So, given the time and interest that one has available, one can examine a number of different traditions and see if there's anything there that makes sense.
Yeah, and given the panorama of worldviews, obviously, that you've been exposed to throughout your career, when Stanley Krippner shuffles off this mortal coil, what do you anticipate? What dreams will come? Do you think? What do you expect will happen?
I expect to be surprised.
Okay. And not to, but to continue or not to continue? Will Stanley Krippner?
It'll be a surprise.
Yeah. In spite of everything you've seen, you're not convinced of anything.
I think that I would have to say that Stanley Krippner per se is a social construct and is the result of a certain historical confluence of influences. And one would not expect that same social construct or that same confluence to exist in another dimension in the same way. Maybe in a different way, but not in the same way.
That makes sense. So, and even in cases of reincarnation where people sort of retain memories of another unified personality?
Yes, they do, but they don't retain all of the memories. They retain bits and pieces. And who knows? That might be the least important part of their psyche. The more important part of their psyche might be off having fun, going to classes, learning new things, and letting these more mundane memories remain behind, sort of to work themselves through and even maybe to play a joke on whatever is surviving.
Yeah, maybe so.
Okay, this one was the hardest one for me to listen to, just in a couple of ways where I think that there's just a real logical breakdown in terms of this whole agnosticism and why we have to be agnostic and science is agnostic. And I think that's just it's just so obviously transparent, and it's really just playing to the status quo and not wanting to ruffle feathers. To me, it seems that science is always changing, and it's always about where we're at now. I mean, this idea that where it might go or we can't go there. We're always where we are. So we're always evaluating the best data we have, coming to the best conclusion we have without really deference to what happened before or what might happen in the future. It seems silly. And for a guy as prominent as Krippner to keep kind of throwing this stuff out there, I mean, it's no wonder that Ray Hyman and James Randi lap it up because it's just silliness.
Yeah, I noticed you always seem to find Stanley Krippner sort of simultaneously provocatively visionary, but also frustratingly non-committal. At least I get that impression from you when you hear his stuff, and maybe some other guys like him. I got to admit, sort of, at least I felt that way about him. I don't know, maybe I'm imputing my sort of some of my frustration onto you, but I actually, after listening to him a lot, I saw him not only at this conference, but then the next week at the Parapsychological Association conference, at which they were honoring his life achievements in that branch of psychology. And I got to admit, my opinion to some extent changed. I've got much more sympathetic, I think, to the sort of the Stanley Krippner worldview, insofar as he has one, I think.
Okay, so maybe so. So anyways, I think what we have here, Rich, is a really nice cross-section of some different views. And obviously coming from the American Psychology Association conference, it adds an interesting flavor to it, doesn't it, as you mentioned at the beginning. So this has been great. Any final thoughts on questions that you'd like to see us maybe try and tackle in the forum regarding these series of interviews?
I think Stanley Krippner's interview to some extent maybe sort of summarized where the other ones might be coming from, or at least it gave a sort of this broad sort of philosophical framework maybe to put them in. And I think maybe insofar as he may have raised some objections sort of in your mind and other people's minds, I think it might be prudent to consider the possibility that maybe a radically sort of pragmatic outlook like his is perhaps key to keeping an open mind and not allowing ourselves to slide from the sort of the dogmatism of reductive materialism to sort of another. At least insofar as a rudimentary intellect like myself can interpret where he's coming from, I think what he's trying to do is to avoid, obviously, from the dogmatic materialist view of consciousness and nature, for that matter. But he is also simultaneously trying to be responsible enough not to jump to any premature conclusions. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
that's great, Rich, and I think that'll make for a very, very interesting discussion that we can all have. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you soon to talk about the Parapsychology Association conference and your interviews from that. So thanks, Rich.
Thank you. We really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks again to Dr. Richard Grego for joining me today on Skeptiko. If you'd like more information about this show or any of our previous shows, please visit the Skeptiko website. It's at Skeptiko. You'll also find there a link to all our previous shows, an email, Facebook link to me, and a link to our forum where you can join in and discuss with Rich and I the topics that we brought up near the end of the show. Well, that's going to do it for today. I have a number of interesting shows coming up. Please stay tuned for all of that. And until next time, take care and bye for now.